Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants around the world. I take this opportunity to congratulate the India International Center for the initiative they have taken in organizing this webinar and thank them for the opportunity they have given me to share what I think is such an important topic. I quote the synopsis of the webinar, which is that the COVID-19 pandemic is taking place in a context where African countries are battling rising debt, huge health infrastructure gaps, and high unemployment, which has limited the scale and effectiveness of government's policy responses. Government debt as a share of GDP has risen sharply in the past 5 years. Africa has witnessed a commodity price amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. While the morbidity and mortality rates from the virus are relatively low, the pre-existing vulnerabilities in the region caused the crisis to pose a threat to livelihoods. The fiscal stimulus packages have been low and narrow in Africa. The pandemic is a call to African governments to close health infrastructure gaps, implement targeted social security programs, and adopt economic diversification to overcome the commodity price shocks. End quote for the synopsis. Now, before requesting the key speaker to commence his talk, I crave your indulgence, and I will give a quick overview of the pandemic situation in Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic has adversely affected the entire world economy, but African governments face greater challenges than most. Africa's first COVID-19 cases were recorded in Egypt on 14 February 2019, and since then, according to the African Union's outbreak brief number 38, a total of 1,518,662 COVID-19 cases and 36,921 deaths have been reported in 55 African Union member state countries, as at the first week of October 2020, which accounts for approximately 4% of all the cases reported globally. Though the virus was slow to arrive in Africa, it has spread quickly and has placed a strain on the already fragile health systems caused by the previous outbreaks of other infectious diseases, such as cholera and Ebola, alongside humanitarian crises and other public health emergencies in the region. It has created a sense of urgency in the continent and inspired calls for coordinated global response to stop the pandemic, mitigate its devastating effects, and thus lay the foundation for long-term recovery. The crisis has drastically altered the economic outlook of almost all African countries this year, and with no cure or vaccine, it is worsening. Some key sectors of the African economy are already experiencing a slowdown as a result of the pandemic. Tourism, air transport, agriculture, and the oil sectors, among others, have been visibly impacted and driving many economies towards a recession, the worst since the 2008 global financial crisis. An analysis conducted by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has predicted a drop from 3.2% to 1.8% in economic growth due to the effects of the pandemic, which could ultimately push up to 27 million people into extreme poverty. The African Development Bank has estimated that Africa will lose between $35 to $100 billion due to the fall in raw material prices caused by the pandemic. Most African governments have implemented measures to curtail the spread of the virus, such as social distancing, border and travel restrictions, school closures, ban on public and large gatherings, curfews and partial lockdowns, and established centers for quarantining of most cases, and so on. Also, innovative use of technology and new ways of working in health and other non-health sectors are being piloted. For example, drones are being used in Rwanda and Ghana, now providing clinics with PPE and coronavirus test samples in the hard-to-reach areas, thus reducing the sample transport time from many hours to 2 minutes. Innovators and investors on the continent have been ramping up homegrown production of key medical commodities such as masks, hand sanitizers, ventilators, and mobile applications to support triage of patients and contact tracing. Research on diagnostics and therapeutics is also active. The Pasteur Institute in Dakar, Senegal, has been evaluating a rapid diagnostic test which, if validated, would be moved forward for local production and distribution at an affordable price. The AU is also in discussions with Madagascar over the Artemisia annua tonic, a herbal potential remedy that their president had presented to the world as Africa's solution to COVID-19. However, some of these measures have resulted in unprecedented societal and economic disruptions, causing hardships and socioeconomic consequences. In a collective effort, African health ministers have adopted the African Africa Joint Continental Strategy for COVID-19, but its implementation requires approximately $420 million in a space of 6 months to stop the pandemic and tackle its immediate economic, humanitarian, and health effects. Although several AU member states and private sector donors have pledged contributions to the AU COVID-19 Response Fund, it would be a major challenge for the continent to meet this demand on its own, and it would therefore need the support of development partners and organizations to get it back on track in its continental integration and development agenda. Economic initiatives have been launched by international funding agencies, development banks, philanthropic organizations, and the private sector to allocate funds to the COVID-19 response. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have thus far committed $20 million to help strengthen emerging operation centers, effective surveillance and contact tracing and isolation on the continent. While the Ethiopian government and the Jagneba Foundation have provided medical supplies, including diagnostics and equipment to each of the 55 countries in Africa. Also, the government of India, Vasudhavya Kutumbakam, has reached out to her African friends with supplies of essential medical kits, which include test kits, consignments of HCQ, paracetamol, and other essential drugs to help the region to fight the spread of the global pandemic COVID-19. In July, the government of Japan, through its permanent mission in Addis Ababa, announced a donation of $1 million to the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the African CDC. The grant will contribute to the implementation of Africa Joint Continental Strategy for COVID-19 mentioned earlier. It will be used to strengthen the capacity of the Africa CDC regional collaboration centers, that they can support effective and efficient communication and knowledge exchange on COVID-19 amongst member states, as well as to support infection prevention and control activities and improve clinical case management of COVID-19. The African Development Bank's COVID-19 response facility has mobilized up to $10 billion to extend financial assistance to address fiscal challenges ensuing from the pandemic, as well as support emergency procurement of drugs, vaccinations, ventilators, and other health-related items and socioeconomic interventions. Now, to conclude my brief opening, African states are developing strategic and in-depth approaches to human development, regional integration, digitalization, industrialization, economic diversification, fiscal and monetary policies, and international solidarity. The virus is severely testing Africa's social, economic, and political resilience and forcing African states to invest in their health system. As the race to find a cure and/or a vaccine for COVID-19 gains momentum, Africa should not wait for the world to come with solution kits, but rather should take its own solution to the world. The continent of Africa has everything it has to take a solution provider, as it is, as the saying goes, a continent too rich to be too poor. I now call on Shri Srinivas to give us a detailed perspective from India of the Africa's economic response to COVID-19. But before I do that, please allow me to introduce him. Mr. Srinivas is an additional secretary to Government of India and director of the National Center for Good Governance. He has served as Joint Secretary and Deputy Secretary in Government of India and is an advisor to Executive Director of India in the International Monetary Fund. As Joint Secretary in the Government of India, he has led Indian delegations to Ethiopia, Chad, Egypt, Mauritius, Kenya, and South Africa. In the IMF, Mr. Srinivas worked on the Sub-Saharan African economies, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility, and the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. As Director General, NCGG, Mr. Srinivas has convened the ITEC NCGG workshop on good governance practices in a pandemic with 26 African countries. He is a senior administrator, a respected academician, and an institution builder par excellence. Mr. Srinivas, the screen is yours.
Let me thank the India International Center, the Chief Program Officer, the Director, for giving me this opportunity to speak on Africa's economic response to COVID-19. Let me also thank Ambassador Jainaba for accepting the invitation to chair this session. We've had a number of interactions on Africa's COVID response to the pandemic and deliberated on the roadmap ahead. I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Chukwuka Onyekwena, the Executive Director, Center for the Studies of Economies of Africa from Nigeria, who's joined this session today. Dr. AVS Ramesh Chandra, Additional Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, the former Deputy High Commissioner of India to Uganda, Dr. Abhijit Chakrabarti, the Deputy High Commissioner of India to South Africa, for their inputs in formulating my views. Let me commence the discussion by what Nelson Mandela said: "Do not judge me by my successes, judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again." Every time I read this quote, my mind keeps going back to my 20 years of association with African countries. In the years 2003 to 2007, I used to work very closely on the Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility, as also the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, when the first HIPC debt write-off for African countries was taken up in right earnest by the international community. Once again, we face an extremely challenging situation due to the COVID pandemic. And let me take you through the research work that I have undertaken on the subject. The COVID-19 pandemic will have substantial economic impact on sub-Saharan Africa, and the economic costs could be devastating. The June 2020 Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa projects that the real GDP will contract by about 3.2%, and per capita income will fall by about 5.5% in 2020, that is to levels which were last seen a decade ago. Africa's regional policies should remain focused on safeguarding public health, supporting people and businesses hardest hit by the crisis, and facilitating recovery. The slowdown this time is being witnessed in the larger economies of Africa. South Africa, the economic activity is projected to contract by about 8%. Nigeria, the economic contraction is projected at 5.4%, and in Angola, the economic activity is expected to fall by about 4%. The impact is quite massive. The pandemic could push about 26 million people in sub-Saharan Africa into extreme poverty in the current year, and if the downside risks to growth materialize, it could go up to 39 million people, almost 4 crore people could go back into acute poverty. People in Kenya are cooking less frequently is what the media is reporting. And people in Uganda say they cannot sustain even 1 day of quarantine, reflecting the high number of hand-to-mouth people working in the informal sector. The global community has come up with 3 solutions. One is called the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, which is being implemented in 21 countries of sub-Saharan Africa, which provides immediate debt service relief for a period of 6 months. The G20, following deliberations in April, came up with the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which is currently being implemented in 46 countries. That is $14 billion debts have been extended for the period May to December 2020. The International Monetary Fund has come up with a rapid financing instrument, which was earlier its natural disasters financing instrument, and that has been implemented in 29 countries with a financial allocation of about $10 billion. But there are huge gaps in international financing at this point of time. Let me quote the famous Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who said, "Humanity, like armies in the field, advances at the speed of the most vulnerable." So the economic slowdown is likely to go at a speed wherein which the most vulnerable would be maximum affected. And countries in Africa need the full force and the full speed of the global community behind them. As I said, the COVID-19 pandemic is taking place in a context where African countries are battling rising debt, huge health infrastructure gaps, high unemployment, and an informality of labor which has limited the scale and effectiveness of government's policy responses. We are also witnessing a commodity price shock, a fall in tax revenues, a fall in export earnings, and a slowdown in domestic economy with the lockdown. What has been Africa's response to the pandemic? The ambassador has correctly pointed out there's been a joint resolution by the African health ministers to come up with unified responses. Several developed economies like Japan and the United States have come forward to put in place financial support measures. What has the continent tried to do for itself? The continent has put in place containment measures to safeguard public health. As early as March 15, 2020, when the 100th case was diagnosed, people were asked to stay at home and their daily movements were reduced. The growth of new cases slowed in recent weeks, but a number of countries have moved cautiously to relax their containment measures. The region is still witnessing an increase in the number of cases, and infections are doubling every 2 to 3 weeks. Economic growth in 37 of the 45 countries has been revised downwards, and economies are expected to contract by about 3.2% in 2020. The external macroeconomic environment has been very unfavorable, with commodity prices remaining low and remittances falling by about 20%. Tourism flows have ground to a halt, and external financing conditions remain extremely tight. Only a gradual recovery is projected after the lockdown restrictions are eased. One figure that actually struck me very much when I was working on this speech was the COVID-19 crisis is set to wipe out nearly 10 years of progress in development. With GDP projected to contract by about 5.4% in 2020, per capita GDP will be back to 2010 levels. The priority is on protecting lives and supporting livelihoods, and international support is urgently required for sub-Saharan Africa, and the financing gap is over 44 billion that currently exists in spite of all the G20 and the multilateral and regional development banks pitching in. Timely fiscal support is crucial, but most countries are constrained. As was said in the opening remarks, the fiscal stimulus packages in Africa have been narrow and low. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa have provided a fiscal stimulus package of only 0.26%. You could compare it with about 9% in Europe. India has had the Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign, which is about 10% of its GDP, and the United States and Canada have had bailout packages of about 11%. The resources in the continent have been allocated to healthcare and virus containment measures and to support vulnerable households. The capacity to increase spending and to mitigate the impact of the crisis remains extremely limited. And for Africa to attain its or maintain its medium-term growth paths, fiscal policy will continue to play a leading role. And targeted cash transfers will help individuals, and targeted support for hard-hit sectors and temporary tax relief efforts are urgently needed. Even countries like Nigeria, which are very oil-rich countries, of the poor fiscal position has made it impossible for them to provide tax relief to businesses and households. High rates of informality and financial exclusion has made it difficult to provide support to micro and small businesses, as well as the poor and vulnerable. Quite clearly, the pandemic is a wake-up call for African governments. Economic diversification is necessary to overcome commodity price shocks. Fiscal responsibility mechanisms are needed to be enforced to curb wasteful expenditure and accumulation of debt, and database systems need to be strengthened to ensure targeted social safety net programs are delivered. While the morbidity and mortality rates from the virus are relatively low in Africa, the pre-existing vulnerabilities in the region have caused the crisis to pose a threat to livelihoods. The African continent also needs to close the health infrastructure gap to provide holistic development to the health sector. Let me go to the country-specific policies. And I went through the various statements given by finance ministers of Africa, and I tried to assimilate the quantum of difficulties that African countries were facing in battling the pandemic. And let me cite a few examples. In Angola, Ms. Vera Davis de Souza, the finance minister, said the revenues from oil exports have shrunk, necessitating expenditure cuts. Angola had to undertake merger of ministries and public bodies, stop infrastructure projects so that monies could be spent on addressing health system gaps and basic expenditures relating to public servants could be undertaken. Further, Angola witnessed a depreciation in exchange rates and the impact on debt service was extremely large. Ms. Vera Davis further said that many African countries are facing similar stress as Angola, and the need for international support to survive the challenges to pursue development and inclusive growth. The elevated debt levels have made more supportive fiscal policy positions difficult. In fact, Angola's budget for 2021 is expected to be very conservative with the objective of keeping debt sustainable. Major revenues are expected from disinvestment proceedings. They had to disinvest something like 21 of their 194 public sector enterprises. The second country that I examined was Ethiopia. Ethiopia's GDP is expected to suffer a reduction of 10.5 percentage points. Ethiopian Airlines, which has the largest fleet in Africa, has announced a suspension of flights. Flower exports from Ethiopia have declined significantly. I saw some of the largest rose gardens I've ever seen in Addis Ababa, and we noticed that flower exports have declined significantly. Even other exports like coffee and oilseeds were also adversely impacted. 30 million people could experience food consumption gaps. Ethiopian migrants from Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, Kenya, and Somalia have come back to their home country. The Prime Minister has announced a multi-sectoral preparedness and response plan, which included allocations for emergency food distribution, health sector response to combat a community spread, and agriculture support. Tax amnesty and forgiveness of all debt prior to 2014-15 was announced. Ethiopia has availed of the IMF support in the form of rapid credit facility. The Central Bank of Ethiopia also provided additional liquidity to the banks. The Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed Ali, announced demonetization of currency to curb cash hoarding, illegal trade, and illicit financial flows. The move was also aimed at boosting the liquidity of banks that were struggling to cope with Ethiopia's cash-based economy. The third country that I look at is Kenya. The Finance Minister of Kenya, Ukur Yatani, has announced a budget deficit for 2021 that could increase substantially due to revenue shortfalls and coronavirus-related disruptions. The Kenyan authorities adopted an economic stimulus package. It included a new youth employment program, provision of credit guarantees, fast-tracking the payment of VAT refunds, and increased funding for cash transfers. The tax revenue measures adopted included full income tax relief for persons earning below $225 per month, and a reduction in income tax and corporate tax rates, as also the turnover tax rates. The Central Bank of Kenya lowered its policy rates, announced flexibility in loan provisioning and classification, and suspended publishing of negative credit information. Let me take you to Nigeria. Nigeria was severely hit by the virus of COVID-19 and has witnessed a sharp decline in oil prices. A budget stimulus package was provided, and also additional financing was provided to Nigeria's Center for Disease Control for purchasing more testing kits, opening isolation centers, and training of medical personnel. The budget stimulus package provided focus on job-intensive projects for agriculture, roads, and housing. A conditional cash transfer program, which was brought in to support state and local government spending needs through the budget. However, Nigeria remains severely hit by COVID-19 and the sharp decline in oil prices. The Finance Minister of Nigeria, Ms. Jainaba, has said the goal of the fiscal interventions was to keep the economy active through carefully calibrated regulatory policy measures designed to boost domestic value addition, de-risk the enterprise environment, attract external investment and sources of funding. Improving tax administration framework to optimize government revenue is a major thrust of the administration's Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative, the SRGI. South Africa remains the largest economy in the region, and Tito Mboweni has been one of the best finance ministers in the continent. And he also is the country representative at the IMFC, representing 24 countries of Africa. And he has said, in sub-Saharan Africa, GDP growth is expected to contract sharply in 2020, driven by pronounced declines in travel, trade, tourism, remittances, and capital inflows. Against this backdrop, South Africa, along with its constituency members, has underscored the need to scale up external support through enhanced access, which will also be critical, including ensuring access to an affordable vaccine. Actually, few countries have been affected more severely by the coronavirus pandemic than South Africa, which suffered a GDP contraction of about 17% in second quarter due to a stringent lockdown and social distancing norm. The government-assisted companies were also facing distress through the Unemployment Insurance Fund, and additional funds were made available for the health response for COVID-19, including loan guarantee schemes for companies was introduced. A solidarity fund with contributions from private contributors was established. Emergency food and shelter to the homeless was also provided. The South African Reserve Bank reduced interest rates a number of times since the pandemic started and issued guidelines for debt relief to the banking customers. In fact, the South African finance minister has asked Parliament to postpone the 2021 budget by a week so that the adjusted estimates of the medium-term economic framework could be reworked. Let me turn to Uganda. In Uganda, two supplementary budgets were passed. Uganda is one of the countries that has received a $300 million support from the World Bank and a $495 million emergency financing from the IMF. There have been two successive interest rate cuts, and charges on mobile money and digital transactions have been reduced. My colleague, Dr. Ramesh Chandra, informed me that Uganda's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been rated the best in Africa in a statement issued by Lancet COVID-19 Commission at the 75th session of the UNGA. Uganda also joined the East African community in evolving a harmonized regional response to the pandemic and establishing a regional mechanism for testing and certification, adoption of digital surveillance, and supporting agro-processing value chains, and establishing a special purpose financing scheme for the small and medium enterprises. What can be done to improve governance, particularly economic governance, and revive growth in a pandemic? There are opportunities in a pandemic also. The provision of credit facilities in enhancing the local industrial capacity, particularly in the production of personal protective equipment, has kept locals employed and mobilized revenues for government. There is an opportunity to strengthen the continent's digital economy, and businesses are adapting to providing remote service delivery, and public institutions such as universities are incorporating virtual infrastructure and techniques, including online courses. Advances in digitalization can play a vital role in supporting Africa's post-pandemic recovery. Expanding the internet access in sub-Saharan Africa by an extra 10% of the population could increase real per capita GDP growth by 1 to 4%. There are a number of success stories, and I'd like to share with you some of the success stories that I have come across in the continent. Technology innovations in mobile health monitoring platforms have emerged. South Africa's Epione.net and Safe Hands Kenya, which uses the existing supply chains to distribute hand sanitizers. Côte d'Ivoire has come up with a new passport agency. Kenya also has an e-citizen portal. Togo has established a solidarity scheme which is implemented through mobile phones. You can contribute to public charity or to fighting the pandemic through mobile phones. And Uganda has established a motorbike taxi app linked online orders for essential services with delivery of goods. In fact, many of the taxi drivers, motorcycle taxi drivers in Uganda, initially found themselves without work. Once the app linked the online orders for essential goods, suddenly the economy through the motorcycle taxi drivers came alive. There are a few other success stories that I'd like to delve on that the United Nations has compiled as best practices for the continent. Mauritius had a public awareness campaign on Facebook and a landing page. This was operationalized by the Ministry of Health and Wellness of Government of Mauritius that a public awareness campaign should be run on social media. A Facebook account and a landing page were set up to create this kind of awareness. In fact, I'm grateful for this input to Ashabaran Chobe, the permanent secretary who is handling this pandemic in Mauritius. The Seychelles has come up with an ArcGIS hub and a COVID-19 response, as also support for work from home for government officers. They designed an online platform to help public health agencies through COVID community notification to ensure community tracing, contact tracing, local situation dashboards for sharing information, and also web map applications to share information on infected cases, critical infrastructure, school closing, and also a GIS database. Further, officers were provided IT solutions across government departments and agencies to work from home by allowing them IT resources access over internet via secure networks. In Benin, the information sharing on COVID-19 was done through a website as a central platform for official information. It's accessible and free for all Beninese internet users, thanks to the distribution by the GSM partners. They also established toll-free numbers for free calls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for all information regarding COVID-19, in regard to screening, support, isolation, reporting, and miscellaneous questions. The same was done with Côte d'Ivoire, and the portal provides an SMS channel in addition to other forms of feedback for sending mass information and raising contact awareness. Ethiopia established a COVID-19 monitoring platform. There is a detailed portal about COVID-19 in Ethiopia, including statistics about the number of tests, confirmed cases, recoveries, and fatalities by city and by region. In order to enable electronic service and payments, a new e-transaction proclamation has been approved by the government. Different technologies have been employed for platforms, web applications, mobile apps, bank operations. Niger established a national response plan against the COVID-19 pandemic through a website. The website offers an interactive voice server with operators providing pre-recorded messages. A teleworking platform for public administrators and e-consultation has also been established. Coming to Tanzania, an e-government initiative with mobile network operators was established. The Ministry of Health and the e-government agency and all the mobile network operators across Tanzania came together to provide preliminary diagnosis to citizens according to locations based on their personal data. There's one success story of Gambia that I'd like to quote. It is the digital call centers to accelerate effective communication and tracking of people in affected communities. Google Plus codes have been adopted locally to strengthen the tracking of patients, and Gambia adopted measures to improve digital skills and literacy, resorting to rigorous testing and robust capacity building of staff of the ICT cadre. The 4 pillars for a digital Africa in this direction are investing in infrastructure, investing in policy frameworks, investing in skills, and investing in risk management. Emerging from the pandemic will depend on integrating these digital strategies within each country's broad developmental agenda. Let me take you to the multilateral response. I was looking at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank's annual meetings that were held over the last weekend. And one subject that dominated the deliberations was to arrive at a multilateral response to Africa's crisis with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. The International Monetary and Financial Committee approved the three measures, the extension of debt service relief under the Catastrophe Containment Relief Trust, the expansion of loan resources under the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, and the extension of the debt service suspension initiative into 2021. However, the private creditors and the non-G20 members have yet to participate in DSSI. So the IMFC felt that we should reach out to the non-G20 members as also the private creditors to join the DSSI initiative. The other major forum is the G20. The G20 agreed on a coordinated approach providing key features for the debt service suspension initiative. It called on the Financial Stability Board to continue monitoring of the financial sector vulnerabilities. The G20 also agreed on a principle of a common framework for debt treatment beyond DSSI. The G20 supported the IMF's $1 trillion lending capacity and the emergency response packages adopted by the World Bank and by the regional development banks. However, there's a huge amount of this $1 trillion lending capacity that has been approved that is yet to be actually utilized. And once there is some clarity on the roadmap forward, more and more countries could perhaps benefit from this huge corpus that has been created. The G24 is the group of developing economies and less developed countries. The G24 has said that debt restructuring is essential to ensure debt sustainability, and there is a need for timely sovereign debt resolution. Effective debt standstills are yet to be worked out. In fact, the G20 chair, the Saudi Minister for Finance, Mohammed Al-Jadaan, has said that 46 countries have availed of the DSSI out of the 73 eligible countries. An extraordinary meeting of the G20 has been convened in November 2020 to update the G20 action plan and commit all available policy options for inclusive growth. What has been India's position at the multilateral forum? India has remained steadfastly committed to Africa's growth and development, and we have stood shoulder by shoulder with all African economies to ensure that growth rates do not plummet to historical lows in this time of crisis. The looming debt crisis, India has said, is a potential threat to post-COVID-19 recovery for low-income countries. Debt sustainability is an important agenda in going forward, and the role of international organizations remains critical. A great effort is needed in ensuring transparency in all forms of debt, and we need to have a meaningful and pragmatic assessment of a country's distress to suggest preventive measures in the incipient stages itself. Let me conclude by saying that fiscal space in sub-Saharan Africa remains extremely limited. Challenges to raise domestic revenue mobilization, along with the risk of decreased financing, both official and private, remain. The path forward is to protect lives and livelihoods, build a more resilient and inclusive economy, and deal with the debt. For many African countries, urgent action is required now, and strong international policy collaboration is needed to speed up recovery. Let me conclude by quoting what the IMF Managing Director has said. It is the long ascent, a journey that will be difficult, uneven, uncertain, and prone to setbacks. So with these words, let me conclude my presentation. And once again,
Sorry about that. My mic was muted. Thank you very much once again for that. Highly informative and interesting analysis on Africa's economic response to the COVID-19. Quite a lot of the participants and the audience have thanked you and are congratulating you on how informative your presentation has been, and are giving commendations to the great effort that you have put into the analysis that you have presented to us. So congratulations and thank you once again. I'll move on to one or two questions, bearing in mind the time period that we have left. One of the major questions has come in regarding the migrants. I think you had touched on it briefly when you spoke about the case study of Ethiopia. And you had mentioned some of the migrants that have come in from Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, Kenya, Somalia. And some of the participants are also asking about comparisons with India, because India also went through quite a period in the beginning of the corona cases where the lockdown was initiated, as to how to go about migrant laborers. If you could please, maybe perhaps do some comparative analysis, if you have that information with you, about the management of the migrants in Ethiopia, and perhaps add some feedback from the stance that India took as well.
Thank you, Ambassador Jainaba, for the very kind comments. The challenge of migrants has been a very difficult task to handle across continents. Pertaining to various challenges in the pandemic, and some of the large number of grievances were evacuation requests, as also movement of migrant labor. The government of India's response was for evacuation of Indian citizens who were stranded abroad was through the Vande Bharat mission, in which about 150,000 Indians could be brought back home. And they had to, of course, undergo the mandatory quarantine at international airports. As regards the domestic migrants, the government commenced home. Government started and a very huge number of the population which was under migration was provided adequate food, as also community centers were opened to provide stay facilities across the nation. In fact, India's armed forces were also deputed, and we did have the Indian Navy, which conducted missions, Operation Samudra Setu, to bring back migrants who were, to bring back Indian citizens who were stranded in some of the island economy. And governments had to come out with agile solutions to ensure that the migrant crisis was adequately addressed.
Thank you for that. I hope all of the audience got the full response to the question. There was some bandwidth issues there, but I have a feeling that they would have most likely received all the information that was required in response to that question. Another one that people are asking about is about, I think you gave the example from Angola. I don't know in your analysis if you came across other African countries, or perhaps even India as well, where they looked at ways of saving and working on the economy. One of the examples given by Angola was they halted some of the infrastructural development projects that they had going on, and which was one of the statements given by the finance minister, I believe you mentioned. In your analysis of the other African countries, was this a mode that they took on as well? Is this something India has also taken on?
What I found with the Angolan experience. In fact, I was listening to and the cost. And the slowdown in the oil economy meant that many of the oil companies were not getting profits that they envisaged. And a massive I did look at the Angolan economy very closely, and what I found was that there was a rapid decline in Angolan oil revenues. And this necessitated that they had to divert a lot of their expenditures towards only basic expenditures, including payments to public servants. And Angola is witnessing a massive slowdown, and as is Ethiopia and the larger economies of South Africa and Uganda. So the supply side major economy or an oil exporter in that sense. India is an oil importer, so the scale of the oil price shock on the Indian economy is much lesser as compared to what the African economies are currently witnessing.
Okay, thank you for that response. Again, quite a few questions. I'll merge some of them, which sort of pertain to each other. Was the impact on education, and also from the gender perspective as well? Education has been hard hit, and we have heard about issues of gender problems as well, increase in domestic violence and things like that due to the lockdown. Now, all of this is going to eventually have an impact on the economy in a few years down the line, especially for the education sector part of it. In your analysis as well, have you come across some projections regarding the impact that this lack of education over the past 7 months would impact on the various countries? Again, please, you can reflect on Africa and India as well.
I did spend a lot of time on how digitalization practices were being implemented in Africa. And I've highlighted the various success stories of the African digitalization initiatives, pointing out that successful implementation of digitalization models could result in a growth jump by about 1 to 4%. However, I have not come across very many success stories in education. And it's not an ordinary year for education. It's been quite a distance education. And there are huge differences between online education and distance education. And to ensure that online education is successfully implemented, digital penetration across rural communities and also the urban communities is necessary. Now, the manner in which the portals were implemented or even online supplies were maintained. Digital call centers in Gambia is one example that I've cited. But with regard to education practices, not too many you would be better placed to let me know. In fact, I tried to reach out to MEGA, the Permanent Secretary of Education, with regard to success stories in educational sector. But as a representative of your country, you could share with us. India has had a huge experience, in fact, successful experience in online education. And Vidya Varthi, the app that was used, has been highly successful in ensuring that education across rural communities was taken up in a major way. In fact, if there is one change that has happened in this period, it is how, with great alacrity, that teachers and schools, as also the educational institutions and the universities have shown with regard to conducting online education across India. And as many as 26 crore or 260 million students were taking classes in this period.
Okay, we move on to another question, and we've discussed quite a bit about what governments are doing. And somebody was asking, what about from the bottom-up approach? Do you have any information on what civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector have been doing in terms of the fight against economic loss during this pandemic? Again, please, on Africa and India as well.
Yes, one thing that struck as a common response was that the solidarity initiative of the African countries that was seen across many African countries where private sector has come forward to contribute to the government's efforts to fight the pandemic. In fact, also the safe hands approach that I highlighted, and people came forward to ensure that they were involved. And when I look at the response that the contact tracing applications have received across Africa, the response has been quite phenomenal. People have come forward to associate themselves with government at this time of crisis, and they have contributed quite liberally to the solidarity trust funds that have been set up so that greater healthcare relief can be provided across the country. India has had a similar experience too. The Prime Minister's Care Fund was established as a charitable trust into which a huge number of public sector as well as private donations have been received, many of which are being utilized for ventilator supplies, for ensuring that additional hospital bed capacities are created, and also for ensuring that many of the emergency financing packages that the pandemic necessitates are being financed.
And again, in follow-up to that, the different roles played by the different sectors. You mentioned briefly that India had placed a high importance on the role of international organizations. Perhaps you could dilate a little bit more on that for us.
Yes, India stood shoulder to shoulder with Africa every time since independence. And this time also, it is no different. I do recall my own experience of working on the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries initiative when the IMF and the World Bank piloted a major debt relief program in 2005, and a huge debt write-off for 39 to 41 countries was taken up in that period. Once again, there is a need for a major debt resolution or a debt standstill, and perhaps in the coming years, a debt write-off at some point of time for these heavily indebted poor countries. The modalities need to be worked out very, very clearly. And India has always stood, and when you see the Finance Minister of India's statement at the IMFC, I was struck by the empathy and compassion that she had for taking the DSSI initiative of G20 forward.
Okay, and bearing in mind we're running out of time, if you could just quickly highlight for us some of the points that you feel Africa could take away from India in terms of their fight against the pandemic and vice versa.
I think both continents, India and Africa, have shown that it is a people's movement. The fight against pandemic has to be a people's movement. And as the Indian Prime Minister has pointed out, do gaz ki duri, mask zaruri. and that we need to adopt social distancing, and we need to keep anxiety levels low so that the pandemic can be fought. Health infrastructure has been strengthened across the Indian subcontinent, and that's what we see across the African continent also. In terms of providing emergency relief also, I think the continent of Africa has done admirably well. In terms of taking forward and revival of growth and livelihoods, that's where the challenge remains, and where the debt overhang seems to provide a huge challenge for the African continent. But the pandemic fight, as the Prime Minister of India pointed out yesterday, is not over. It still is an ongoing battle. A vaccine has to be identified. And the Indian experience has been that we stand with the global community in terms of a supplier of medicines. Over 100 countries, the hydroxychloroquine and paracetamol have been supplied. Further, even HCQ has been exported to many countries across Latin America and the United States. So India has stood forward in terms of its multilateral commitments with the global community in this time of crisis.
Right, and finally, the world seems to be experiencing the dreaded second wave. Quite a few countries have gone back into lockdown, and it appears as if it's something that is going to be, well, God forbid that that would be the case, but it's most likely going to be across the board. From your perspective and the analysis that you have been doing, what are the major things that can be implemented during the second wave, again, to have a mitigating effect on the devastation that it will cause on the economies around the world?
I think extreme caution is required, and one needs to be very vigilant, ensure that the social distancing norms are adequately followed, also to ensure that offices are duly sanitized and deep sanitation practices are taken up. In terms of, there must be extreme caution that is urged at this time of festivities in India, and that is what has been the plea of the government to its citizens. And we hope that as successfully as the nation has fought the first wave, in case there is a second wave at all, the nation would stand up to fight the second wave.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And may I please, I've just received, sorry, one last question. I'm aware that we're running out of time, but we'll quickly slot this question in. And we received a question about the level of preparedness of the vaccines. Again, I know you are doing your research on economic impacts, on the virus in Africa. But during your analysis, did you come across this level of preparedness of the vaccines in Africa and India? I know you touched on it briefly, but if you could just close with that question.
The level of vaccine preparation in Africa, as I read out from the statement of the South African Finance Minister, South Africa has, on behalf of 24 nations, has called out that there should be equity adopted by the global community in vaccine distribution. In India, trials are going on. In fact, you were there in the workshop when Professor Randeep Guleria presented the Covaxin trial that was being taken up at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Then that was quite an exciting picture to see a patient actually taking a vaccine trial at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So trials are currently going on, and we hope that a vaccine is found as expeditiously as possible.
Fingers crossed. And Mr. Srinivas, can I give you a moment or two to give some closing remarks? And then we'll end the session as we're running out of time now.
The challenge that Africa currently faces is one of the great challenges that it has faced in the last 2 decades that I have studied it. And that was what has enthused me to pursue this deep study of African continent on how they were fighting the pandemic. And my interactions with over 26 countries in Africa had felt that there was an urgent need for several policymakers across the globe to stand up to ensure that the continent's distress levels are adequately discussed and addressed at some point of time. There is optimism, as the annual meetings of the Fund and Bank have pointed out, that the global community is standing up to ensure that the deep distress levels that have been projected are overcome with adequate international financing support. So we stand together, shoulder to shoulder, India and Africa, to take this initiative forward.
So thank you very much. I must use this opportunity to say on a personal level that you have been a great friend of Africa. During my tenure, I have seen the enthusiasm with which you interact with the joint projects that we have together, and I commend you on that. And I use this opportunity, we've run out of time, I apologize, I should have been a little bit stricter with my time, to thank the India International Center for organizing this, and especially you, Mr. Srinivas, for taking your time and your effort to go in and do this research on Africa and yielding, all of these insights that, is some of which are news to me, and I've taken a lot away from this, as have most of the audience who have been congratulating you on the great show and the in-depth perspective that you have given on this subject matter. And to express my gratitude to everybody in the background who has been assisting with technical hitches and ensuring that this has gone as smoothly as it has done. Once again, thank you to all of the audience and the participants, and to ICC, and especially you, Mr. Srinivas. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.